WP-Get Web Dev Tutorials for all user levels. The basics to get you up and running quickly. Okay, so today's tutorial I'm basing on a question here in the Elementor Facebook community, and this is by Gabriel, and this is a question that comes up quite a bit, where what he wants is, after submitting an Elementor form, he wants to have a pop-up and have a custom message on that pop-up based on what the user entered on the form. I've seen this in various questions in various ways, and there's no built-in way that I can find in Elementor to do this. There are some plugins you can get which will do it, but I thought I'd have a crack at this, and the first thing I tried was using a custom Elementor form action. The problem with that is that it submits the form using AJAX. So what I'd have to do is store the form values on the PHP session, then I'd have to have either REST or AJAX query to retrieve it. So a better way I thought might be to save the form values into LocalStorage in the browser as they're entered, and then you can restore those or recover those with JavaScript as needed. So that's the method that I've used today, and the one that I'm going to demonstrate. So I've created a tutorial which I'll put up at the end of this video and add my video in there. So basically a description of what I just went through, and I've got 7 steps here, very simple steps, where I'll go through and make it work. It's a very simple demonstration, and then we'll go in depth through the code as a separate part of the tutorial, so you can understand what I've done. One thing I want to note here is that it's an initial attempt. It only works with one form on the page. We haven't built it so it'll work with multiple forms, but it does work well and it'll serve most purposes. So let's hook right into it here. So the first thing we want to do is add a form to the page. So we want to drag an Elementor form to the page, and we're going to go to the advanced settings and set the CSS ID. So I'm just going to copy that from there. Head over to where are we? I've got a blank page all set up, ready to go. So I've got a blank page here. Grab a form, and just a standard Elementor form, drag it into a section, go to the advanced, and I'm going to set my CSS ID. Copy that, paste that into their source form. Okay, so there's my step 1 done. We want to grab an HTML widget and add that to the page just under the form. Drag that and drag it just under the form. I then want to grab my JavaScript from below and paste it into the widget container. So if I head down the page, you'll see I've got my main JavaScript here. Single left click, copies to the clipboard. Go back to my HTML code and paste that in there. Actually, that has stripped out the script tag. So I'm just going to put the script in there. I forgot that when we add this into the code highlighter, it strips out your script tags, even if we escape it for some reason. So we just need to wrap that in script, and there's our HTML script. I'm just going to name this so we know what it is. So I'll call it main JavaScript. Okay, come back to our tutorial, and now we've finished step 2. The next step is we're going to put a header on the page so we can watch that change as the form changes. So I'm going to grab a heading widget to the page and set the CSS ID to target for heading name. Now these names are only important because the JavaScript references these. So I'm going to grab a heading, drag it to a new section, and I'm going to set the CSS ID as per my tutorial, and in here it says to edit the content and put a single space in. The reason we do that is sometimes if you don't have anything in there, if we just delete it all, it won't render the element. I've had this happen in the past. If you put a single space in, it makes sure that it renders the element. So there's our step, Step 3 done. Now we need the JavaScript for that heading. So we need another HTML widget. I'm going to drag that just below my heading. And we're going to grab the JavaScript for that from the bottom here. So that's the next slot here. For some reason this one worked, it's got the script in there. Click to copy, so left click, head back over to my HTML code, paste that in, and we'll call that the heading.js. Just to keep it nice and clean. All right, so there's our heading.js. Head back over to here. So we've now done step 4. We're now going to create a pop-up. Now, the reason we're going to do the pop-up is we're going to show how this works from a button. So actually, before I do that, if I just update this now, just show you what that looks like on a page. Whoops. Got these full screen, so my page isn't showing correctly. Here we go. Refresh that. So I haven't put my button there yet. I've got a heading widget down here, and as I type my name, press the enter key, that heading widget updated down there. If I put my full name, press the enter key, now the heading widget's updated. So that's what the JavaScript is currently doing. So that's done to that point. So heading back over here, we want to do a pop-up. So I'm just going to go back to my back end, go into our templates and pop-ups. I'm going to add a new pop-up. I'll just call this test pop-up. Create that. Okay, we'll make it a simple pop-up, single section. I'll just put a drop shadow on it so you can see it. And I'll grab a heading widget saying thank you. And then another heading widget. Underneath there, I just head back over to my tutorial. So we want to add the first heading widget. We then want to create a, so our second heading widget, we want to add the target name as the CSS ID on this heading widget here. So I'm going to set my CSS ID. And again, we're going to just put a single space in there so we've got nothing in there. Okay, so our next step is the JavaScript for this particular one. So I'm going to drag an HTML widget to the page and grab some more JavaScript. So HTML. So when my editor's doing something funny here, just refresh it. Okay, go back to my heading there, HTML widget. Drag it there and just bring it down. I'll call that JavaScript. Back over to my tutorial. So it's telling me to grab the JavaScript below. So that's the last one, which is this here. We're going to grab that and paste that into here. Now I've got this console log in it, and the reason I did that is because I wanted to show how this JavaScript runs every time the pop-up opens. So when the pop-up is added to the DOM, the JavaScript runs, which is why we don't need to wait for jQuery and why we can just have this simple JavaScript, because this runs every time we open up the pop-up. So this little init is just showing that that happens. You can take that out when you're ready for it. So that's our pop-up done. We don't need to add any conditions. So head back over to our tutorial. And the last part is to add a button to our main page and open the pop-up with that button. So back over to our main page, I'm going to add a button. And we're going to put that button down the bottom here. Oh, what's going on with my editor today? You gotta love demonstrations. I was having no issues whatsoever with this while working it out. Now that I'm showing you, I have issues. Okay, there we go. So we got a button there. I'll just call that open Popup. And we're going to use the dynamic tag, and we're going to select an action to open the pop-up, hit the spanner, and we're going to go test, because we called it test pop-up. So we're going to test pop-up there, update that. Okay, now if I view this page, here it is there. And I'll just do a Control F5 just to make sure we're viewing it properly. So if I type in my name as Alan and press the Enter key, my heading widget opens up. And sorry, my heading widget gets updated with the name of that. If I hit the open pop-up, it says thank you, Alan. If I change that to Bob, the heading widget changed to Bob, open the pop-up, and it says thank you, Bob. So it works. It's a way of doing it. It does save on local storage. So if we look in our application here, in our local storage, we can see we've got a source form here where I've got a JSON encoded string with things as I change them. In fact, you can actually see that if I put Mary, press the Enter key, we can see our local storage update down here. Now that brings me to one other thing. So I think that's fine because it's as you change these properties, you browse away from it, then the local storage changes. If you wanted this different, if you wanted it to change every time you pressed a key, which I can't see a use case for, what we'd do is head back over to... Okay, so what I'm going to do is look at my main.js. I'm going to change my trigger up here to key up. Update that. And then head back over to my test page and just do a Control F5. And I will make that John. And as I'm typing, you can see it updating the header. So that's storing it in the local storage, and then it's triggering event, which is then using JavaScript to add it back to here, open pop-up, and it's thank you, whatever I typed. So I think that's a really easy way of doing it. It does use local storage, so unless you clear the storage, it's going to have the same details in there. So you might have it so if you're going to use a pop-up here, you might, on the close of that pop-up, you might run a JavaScript, and what that JavaScript would do is it would call this clear local storage and clear that out. So that's the initial tutorial. I'm going to end this here now, and then I'm going to do another recording and I'll talk through this in detail. Thank you. The details for explanation on how everything works. Okay, so now for the JavaScript in detail. Now, this might be beyond some people, but hopefully others will get benefit out of this. So as always, I start my JavaScripts with a semicolon, just in case the previous script didn't end with one, and that can create some problems with minification. So that's just as a caution, always start with a semicolon. I then use a closure, which is this open bracket down to the close bracket, which gives me my own scope inside here, so I don't have to worry about variable names clashing with other variables in other scopes. So that just tidies this JavaScript up, so I don't have to have really long fancy names just to avoid clashes. So that's the closure. I'm using ES6 syntax with this arrow function, and I'm passing in the variable W, which is being populated with window. So instead of having to type window out, so in fact down here, instead of typing window, I could just say W. It's exactly the same thing. So window passes in to here as a property, which then becomes available in this function. So the first thing we do is we want to have some variables declared using ES6. So let means I can redefine them. And we want to look for a jQuery dollar representation and a jQuery form object. So these can't be defined until jQuery is ready, which is when either the DOM content or the document is loaded. Then we set some constants here, which is we want to say what form widget ID do we want to look for to target for saving. What do we want to call our local storage variable? What inputs are we going to look at? So I've just said inputs of input and text area. You could add checkboxes, you could add whatever you want to that. Anything that is a valid HTML input that you want to track, you can just add to this input selector. That's a jQuery selector, so you separate them by commas, and that means import and text area, not import and then text area. And what triggers are we going to look for? So I'm just going to look for the change trigger. So once you browse away from an input, then it's going to trigger the change, and we're going to use that. So the first thing we're going to do is wait for the window, or we're going to add event listener to the window, listen for load, and then we're going to run a function to define $$ as jQuery, and then call our init function. Init function basically gets a reference to the form and saves it as a jQuery object. So this variable up here is now populated. We're going to find all of the inputs based on the input selector, and we're going to say on our triggers, in this case change, we want to set the local storage. So we call this function here. So I'm using a bit of a sneaky technique here where I'm grabbing all of the stuff from the form using jQuery's serialize, so I don't have to go through and individually find each one. So I'm using a convert form to JSON, and I'm getting the actual form element from my Elementor Form widget. So this jQuery reference here is to the form widget. Now there's wrappers, so inside those wrappers we then find the actual HTML form element, and that's what we want. So we call a function from here which passes in the form, and it goes through a jQuery serialize, passes through each of those, grabs the form values and stores them in a JSON object. Okay. So we just basically serialize the whole form and create a JSON object from it. Now, we cannot store JSON on cookies or local storage, so we have to use the JSON stringify to turn that JSON object into a string. So what we're saying is we want to set the local storage, set an item with our variable name to the string version of the form elements. Pretty straightforward so far. We then want to create an event. So I've just called it form to local storage, and then we want to dispatch that event on the window. So every time we set the local storage with the new form values, it dispatches this event. Then we can have listeners on that going, hey, something's changed, I need to update. I've just also made a clear local storage function so we can delete the local storage if it is not no longer required. So it could be when you close your Popup, etc., or you might have a reset button or a clear button, or whatever you want to do, and it clears this out so that it's done. Okay, we then have a function to get a variable from our local storage by name. So basically it gets the item from the local storage, passes the JSON, because we stringified it, we pass it back to an object. The field names get stored as form underscore fields, bracket, name, bracket. So we want to actually, that will be our name that we want to recover. And then if the object exists, then we want to return that value for that object, otherwise return an empty string. If we don't do that and the value hasn't been set, it's going to generate a JavaScript error because this does not exist. So this is just a way of, if it doesn't exist, empty string. If it does exist, return it. Okay, pretty straightforward. We then go through and on the window object, we create a variable called form to local, call it whatever you like, and we expose these two functions, so the get value by name and clear local storage. Straightforward so far. Now, that's our main JavaScript. Then head down to our heading JavaScript down here. And again, all we're doing is declaring some variables. So jQuery, the variable name we want to restore, the target. So what is the target we're going to update? So in this case, it is the heading widget. And because again, when we add a CSS ID, it's for the widget, not for the element we want to target. So we want to find the H2 in this case inside that widget, and that becomes our jQuery target. So when the DOM content's loaded, assign jQuery to $, and get a jQuery reference to our target. We're then going to listen here to this form to local storage. So remember back over here, every time the local storage is updated, we throw this event on the window, which is form to local storage. We then listen for that event down here on the window object. So window or W, add event listener, form to local storage, call this function, where all we're going to do is grab from form to local, get value by name, the variable name, so we want to get the name, so the name field on this form, and then we're going to set the target's text value to whatever that value is that's returned. Straightforward so far. So update the local storage, throw an event, listen for the event, get the value that we want from the local storage, and then update our heading. All right, so heading over to our pop-up. I'm just going to edit the pop-up. Okay, so on the pop-up, again, we've got our heading here with a CSS ID of target name. We've got some JavaScript here. And this JavaScript gets a reference to jQuery as $. We want to get the name from that. The target selector, again, it's the heading here, and then the H2 within that widget. So get a reference to that, jQuery reference to that target. We want to then call our method from our main JavaScript to get value by name with the variable name, and then the target, set the text to whatever that value is. So this is pulling the value from the local storage. We don't need to listen for an event listener here. We don't need to listen for the DOM content loaded or on or the document load events, because this script runs as the pop-up is added to the DOM. The way Elementor works is it removes and adds the pop-up from the DOM as needed. So every time it adds it to the DOM, it runs the JavaScript that's on it. So you can run any JavaScript on here and it will run every time the pop-up opens. So that's pretty much how this works. So I hope that makes sense and you get some good value from this.